Hello, everybody. My name is Judith Kolikoff, and I'm part of the organizing group that brought Brant here for all of you to hear. And it's been a wonderful journey so far, and I'm sure tonight will only contribute to that. So I thank you all for coming, and I want to thank the sponsors of this event, and I'm going to name them, okay? There's Kadima Reconstruction Community, American Friends Service Committee, Jewish Voice for Peace, Super, and I don't try to translate that, but it's a wonderful student group at the university. They'll have to tell you what it means. I think I know, but I don't want to try. Voices for Palestine, University Temple United Methodist Church, Mideast Focus Ministry at St. Mark's Cathedral, and I can't pronounce this correctly, but a temple named, help, Kol Hashima, right? Okay, you've heard it, right? United Nations Association of Greater Seattle, the Episcopal Bishops Committee on Israel and Palestine. So it's a very broad and diverse group who work hard on this issue, and they've all conspired together to help us bring Brant for you to hear tonight. Rabbi Brant Rosen has been the spiritual leader of the Jewish Reconstructionist Community in Evanston, Illinois, since 1998. A graduate of UCLA and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, Rabbi Rosen is also a longtime activist for peace, social justice, and human rights in many areas. In 2010, he was awarded the Inspiration for Hope Award by the American Friends Service Committee in Chicago for his activism on behalf of peace and justice in the Middle East. And in 2008, he was honored by Newsweek magazine as one of the top 25 pulpit rabbis in America. His book, Wrestling in the Daylight, was published by Just World Books in 2012. Rabbi Rosen has written a courageous and groundbreaking book. He takes on the volatile issues of Jewish faith and values and challenges the traditional homeland narrative as Israel as he describes the difficult and frequently painful personal journey he took to Palestinian solidarity. He listens to his dissenters with respect and challenges with integrity and respect. He provides a model that enables a remarkable, truly remarkable, and we experienced one this morning with a very diverse group of clergy, truly remarkable civil and respectful conversation where great divergence exists in ideas and beliefs. To quote Brant, a rabbi shares his ideological evolution toward Palestinian solidarity, lively conversation ensues. So here's Brant.
Thank you so much, Judith, for that very gracious introduction. And thank you to Judith and to Kadima Reconstructionist Congregation and all of the wonderful co-sponsors of this evening's program. I'm just very humbled that my appearance here has brought together so many diverse groups doing such important work. And I know this has a great deal to do with the organizing efforts of many, many people to come together. And I think coming together, this kind of coming together is really at the heart of what I see my job as, my activism. So I want to thank you all for being here, and especially the sponsors of our program for making it possible. Thank you for the very gracious introduction. I'm going to have to really go over my bio, I think. There's things that need to be tweaked there. I don't know how much longer I can use that Newsweek 2008 pulpit rabbi thing, but... So I want to say a little bit about what I would like to have happen here this evening. As Judith mentioned, I'm most interested in engaging in conversation. I will certainly talk a little bit about my own thoughts, my own ideas, my own journey on this particular issue, but it's really in service of having a conversation. And a good deal of my activism is around trying to widen the parameters of what is considered to be acceptable discourse on this subject in the Jewish community in particular, but not only in the Jewish community. I am part of a growing coalition within the Jewish community and beyond the Jewish community that is seeking a just situation between Israel and Palestine. And I think particularly in the Jewish community, there I see the awakening of a willingness to tolerate a level of discussion that has heretofore been seen as off limits. The Jewish community is my native habitat. I'm a pulpit rabbi. I work in a nice suburban middle-class Jewish congregation, JRC in Evanston. We have about 530 households. It's a liberal left-leaning congregation, but by no means do they agree with everything I say or do, particularly on this issue. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later, about the impact of my activism on my congregation and how we go forward together. But the fact that I continue to work as a rabbi and continue to work in my primary role as a congregational rabbi in the community gives me heart. It helps me feel like we can start to have conversations that were considered forbidden before. I know that because I'm having them. So I'm hoping that will be our program tonight. My book, and I'm going to read a little bit from the book, which the book is really a conversation. It is an anthology of blog posts that I wrote on my blog beginning at the end of 2008, December 2008, and for the next 2 years, where I really chronicled my own evolution on Israel-Palestine, my own change of heart, change of approach, change of my own relationship to Israel. And I used my blog primarily as a way of thinking out loud about the journey that I was going on. And along the way, many people commented on these posts. And there was this amazing conversation that continued up until present day, really. I always felt like the conversations on the blog, on cyberspace, could be some kind of model for face-to-face conversation. It was truly remarkable, and I'll talk a little bit about how that all happened as well. So really the book, I'm using the book as sort of a mechanism, as a model for conversation, but also as a mechanism as I travel around when I'm able to have these kinds of conversations in public and in person. So again, I thank you for coming, and I want to underline what Judith said about my hope that we are able to model the values of civil discourse, to really not come here to convince other people of the rightness of our views, but really to speak our own truths and to actively listen to others with the hope that we might be able to find a way forward together. Not despite our differences, but perhaps maybe allowing those differences to inspire us to find a way forward together. So just a little bit of autobiographical. I am, as I mentioned, a pulpit rabbi. I've been a rabbi since 1992. I've always been a congregational rabbi, even though when I was in rabbinical school as a young man, I swore up and down that I would never be a congregational rabbi. I was very cynical about congregations and felt that congregational Judaism was dry and bereft. And in the end, I graduated and found that, in fact, there are many very exciting congregations, and congregations can be, there are congregations doing really remarkable work. And I've never worked as a rabbi doing anything else in the end. Growing up, I'm from the West Coast originally. I'm from Southern California. I grew up in Santa Monica, and I would say my own identification as a Jew was almost from the beginning as a Zionist and with the state of Israel at the center. My family identified as Zionist. I visited Israel with my family when I was 10 or 11 for the first time. We have many family members in Israel, and I have many friends there. When I started to rediscover my own Judaism in my own way and on my own terms, Zionism, and particularly liberal Zionism, was really at the center of it. It was a large part of my own excitement about Jewish life. I identified Zionism as a kind of national liberation movement of the Jewish people. And the mythic story of the Zionist movement and the birth of the State of Israel is a very powerful story. It speaks very profoundly and has to generations of Jews now. even secular Jews, I think it has religious power for secular Jews, I would say. It certainly did for me. It's a redemptive story, right? It's a story of a people, a horribly persecuted people who have just experienced the Holocaust and this new liberation, the state of Israel born out of the ashes of the Holocaust. And it was, I think the redemptive nature of that story spoke very deeply to me. I will pause and say that I use that term religious very consciously. I do think that Zionism has been for decades now, maybe even the better part of a century, the civil religion of American Jews. I think that even for secular Jews, it has a religious power, and there are lots of examples of that. In the early days, the Reform movement, for instance, was anti-Zionist. I'm sure many of you know this, that the Reform movement, for religious reasons, opposed political nation-statism in Palestine, but eventually came around to accepting Zionism as well. And today, all of the major denominations are quite Zionistic. And if you look at for instance, one example is if you look at the prayer book of all of the major denominations, Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Orthodox, if you look in these prayer books, you'll find something called the Prayer for the State of Israel, Tfilah leMedinat Yisrael, and it is a text that was written by the chief rabbi of Israel in 1948 after the establishment of the state, and the opening line is very famous, and it refers to Israel as Reshit Smichat Geulatenu, the Israel is the first flowering of our redemption. And this is a religious prayer that is in all of the major American Jewish denominations' prayer books. So I think that speaks very powerfully to how deeply embedded Zionism is in the psyche of American Judaism. If you go to most synagogues in the United States and you go into the sanctuaries of these synagogues and you look at the Eastern Wall, I would say still probably the majority of them, you will see the Aron Kodesh, the Ark, where the Sefer Torah, the Torah scroll, our most sacred book, is housed. And on either side of the Ark, you'll find an American flag and an Israeli flag. And it's so common that I don't think we stop to think about what that really means. I mean, these symbols are right next to our most sacred text. We pray toward it. We bow in this direction, and it has a sacred power. Israel, the Israel story and Zionism is very much, I think, deeply embedded in the civil religious identity of American Jews. I think that's starting to unravel a bit. I'll talk a little bit about that later as well. But it certainly was for me. And as I got older, I identified in particular with what I would call liberal Zionism. I was very, very connected to the ideas of labor Zionism in particular. I lived in Israel for 2 years, and most of that time I was on 2 different kibbutzim, and I thought very seriously about moving to Israel, joining a group of folks who would move to a specific kibbutz. I did not do that. I decided to come back to the States and become a rabbi instead. That's another story you don't need to know about. I was 21 years old at the time, so but it was still, even in making that decision, I knew that Israel would be a very important part of my life. I knew I would visit often, which I did. And when I say liberal Zionism, that means not only, the values of kibbutz, but also I identified very strongly with the peace movement, with Peace Now, with the efforts to strengthen the peace process and to move toward a 2-state solution. I'm still old enough to remember that once upon a time talking about a 2-state solution, talking to Arafat and the PLO was considered, beyond the pale in the Jewish community. Now it is at the center of the Jewish establishment approach is the 2-state solution. But I remember very powerfully the various efforts at the peace process in Oslo in 1993. I was a strong advocate. I'd been a rabbi for a year and spoke out a great deal about the importance of supporting Oslo. Actually, our older son was born in 1993, and the day he was born was the day that the handshake on the White House lawn took place, and we decided to change his middle name, the name that we were going to name him in Hebrew, to Shalom. So it was for those of you that remember, it was it was a time of great promise and optimism, and I think that promise was relatively short-lived. But for the majority of my rabbinate, I was a strong advocate for the peace process and the two-state solution. And the occupation was a horrible thing. What was going on vis-a-vis the Palestinians was a terrible thing, but if we could only have this two-state solution, everything would be fine. And at the same time, I think, I know now that I had these nagging doubts about all of this. And I did my best. I did a very good job of keeping these doubts at bay, but I can look back and realize that they were fairly constant. I entertained now and then these thoughts about, well, what is this business of Jewish political nationalism and creating an ethnically Jewish state in this part of the world that has traditionally been so multi-ethnic and multi-religious? And what does this mean? What does a Jewish state mean? A state that is so radically dependent on maintaining a demographic ethnic majority of Jews in order for it to be a viable Jewish state. And many liberal Jews, liberal Zionists, will talk about this very openly. We'll talk about the importance of a two-state solution, not necessarily from a moral point of view, that the Palestinians deserve a state of their own, but really from a demographic point of view. You hear this a great deal, that with the Palestinian birth rate, that we need a two-state solution because Palestinians pose a quote-unquote demographic threat to the integrity of the Jewish state, right? If we allow this to continue without creating some kind of new political parameters. And every now and then I'd sort of stop and think, the Palestinians are a demographic threat to the integrity of a Jewish state? I mean, as an American, I would never dare say such a thing about any ethnic group. As an American, I cherish my civic American national identity and believe that all peoples share that identity. But what does it mean to advocate for a kind of a nationalism that is predicated on having a racial majority within certain borders? And I would entertain those thoughts and then just sort of retreat back. Usually the way I would deal with those questions is, well, it's very complicated. Those words are, I think, come very easily to our lips, that we deal with very painful issues by retreating into the complexities of the situation. But I also, there were other issues as well that were connected to that, the circumstances around the birth of the State of Israel, especially around the early 90s, which was when the Israeli New Historians' works were first translated into English, works like by people like Benny Morris and Ilan Pape and Baruch Kimmerling and Avi Shleim. I'm sure many of you have heard of some of these names. And these were Israeli historians who had looked at recently declassified military documents and were able to, I think, conclusively from a historical point of view, point out, I think what many had already suspected for a long time was that the mythic story of Israel's founding that had to do with a land without a people for a people without a land, and the people who did live there, Israel, the Jewish Yishuv at the time wanted to stay, and they were caught in the crossfire. The Arab governments told them to flee. We learned that all of these stories were mythic, and that the truth is that they were, in many cases, forcibly removed from their villages and from cities, and almost all of these villages were destroyed, and they were not allowed to return to the ones that weren't destroyed. And this huge refugee population was created largely because it had to happen. I mean, it's connected to that demographic issue, right? That in order to create a demographically Jewish state, the presence of non-Jews is a problem. And so reading those works had a very powerful effect on me as well. But I would also retreat back to the complicated thing. Many of us would say things like, well, look at the birth of the United States. This is how nations are created. It's a messy business. Nationalism is a messy business, and that's just, that's how it's always been. So I think for the first 10, 15 years of my rabbinate, I really dealt with Israel through avoidance, by and large. I would talk a great deal about the importance of a two-state solution and supporting the peace process, even though in my gut I started to feel like there was something hollow there. Every time there would be a new go-round by whether it was George Bush the first or Bill Clinton in Oslo or later with George Bush the second, all of these various iterations of the peace process, we would always hear that, well, now we have a window of opportunity. We can't pass up this window of opportunity. And I would be out there championing this window of opportunity. By the way, there is a new window of opportunity, you may have heard, with the rebooting of the Arab League peace plan, and we're hearing the same rhetoric. And if that was me several years ago, I would be out there talking about the importance of not passing up this window, which was closing very quickly. And the window apparently is still closing. I'll talk about that in a second as well. In the meantime, I did go twice to the West Bank. I had the opportunity to go and see for myself the occupation well into the Oslo period, where the West Bank was divided up into 3 sections, and I saw what was going on in Area C, the largest area in which has the largest number of Jewish settlements. And I saw the wall, I saw the checkpoints, I visited refugee camps and went to Hebron, where I saw separate Jewish and Arab sidewalks. And my resistance was starting to crumble then, but it really, and continuing into 2006, when Israel started to bomb Lebanon in response to rocket fire coming in from Hezbollah in South Lebanon, the Gaza blockade I found to be very, very troubling, and I actually signed a public letter condemning it, which was the farthest I'd ever gone publicly. But it really wasn't until Operation Cast Lead that my defenses finally just sort of broke on this issue. And I remember very vividly, it was December 28th, 2008, and I was reading the first news reports of Israel's massive military assault into Gaza, and the initial ones were in Gaza City, by and large, in the north part of the Gaza Strip. And there were about 250 people killed in that first military operation, and I was reading about bodies lying in the streets and police cadets at a graduation ceremony who were just wiped out, and including children. And and all of this going on in a tiny strip of land, a 140 square mile patch of land with 1.5 million people in it, who had nowhere to run, which was blockaded. I read this and I was just stunned. And I realized that I had passed a kind of a Rubicon. I couldn't continue to deal through avoidance or with platitudes. And so I sat down on my blog, which I had been writing for about 2 years up until then, and which was largely just a nice venue for me to write about things I like to write about. A lot of them had to do with Israel and Palestine, but others, I talked about all kinds of social justice issues. And back in those days, I wrote about all kinds of silly stuff. It was 2006 was well before grown-ups discovered Facebook. So I sort of, I would put silly little YouTube videos on there. If you go back and look at the early days, it's very different than it is now. But I sat down to my blog and I just wrote very quickly, it wasn't a particularly eloquent post, but I wrote it and I sent it, and I'll read that for you now. It's entitled Outrage in Gaza, No More Apologies, December 28th, 2008. The news today out of Israel and Gaza makes me just sick to my stomach. I know I can already hear the responses. Every nation has a responsibility to ensure the safety of its citizens. If the Qassams stopped, Israel wouldn't be forced to take military action. Hamas also bears responsibility for this tragic situation. I could answer each and every one of these claims in turn, but I'm ready to stop this perverse game of rhetorical ping pong. I don't buy the rationalizations anymore. I'm so tired of the apologetics. How on earth will squeezing the life out of Gaza, not to mention bombing the living hell out of it, ensure the safety of Israeli citizens? We good liberal Jews are ready to protest oppression and human rights abuses anywhere in the world, but are all too willing to give Israel a pass. It's a fascinating double standard, and one I understand all too well. I understand it because I've been just as responsible as anyone else for perpetrating it. So no more rationalizations. What Israel has been doing to the people of Gaza is an outrage. It has brought neither safety nor security to the people of Israel, and it has wrought nothing but misery and tragedy upon the people of Gaza. There, I've said it. Now what do I do? And that last question was sort of misunderstood at the time. I think many people thought I was asking for practical advice, so they would write things like, oh, you should write this letter, or you should march in this rally, or you should write to this congressman. And really, for me, it was a much deeper question than that. It was an existential question, really. It was a time of great anguish for me, and I was not really sure where I was anymore. I wasn't sure if I could be in the Jewish community and write these things. I wasn't sure if I could be a rabbi and write these things, or continue to have a job even. And yet I wasn't sure, I still, I think, held on to this sort of zero-sum mentality where it's either I stand with Israelis or stand with Palestinians. And so the question was, well, what do I do now? And it was just this moment of great vulnerability where I just wrote it and sent it. And I didn't regret sending it because I think I would have regretted much more not sending it. But what happened was I got a flurry of responses, many, many more than I'd ever gotten before and probably since, up to 200 comments. They just kept coming and coming day after day. And many were from congregants, and many were from people I will never meet and have no idea who they were, but they ranged from people saying unprintable things and some of those I didn't actually publish, but there were many people who were excoriated me for saying these things and for not standing with Israel at its time of need, and didn't I understand that Israel had to do this, that any nation cannot stand by when its people are under attack. And on the other end, I had many, many people, including many Jews, saying, I thank you for saying this. I've never heard a rabbi say these things before, and I want to thank you for saying them. And then I had a lot of people in the middle saying, this is interesting. What do you mean by this? What are the implications of where you're going with this? And they just kept coming and coming, and eventually people started talking with one another as well as to my own responses. And I realized that it was something very fascinating was going on, that people were actually eager to talk about it, and maybe in the relative anonymity of the internet, people felt able to do it, although I knew the identities of many of the congregants who had shared. So I was emboldened by this, and I think by saying these things out loud, that helped me, encourage me, I think, in ways that I probably wouldn't have otherwise, to write more. I wrote constantly during Cast Lead, and this conversation carried on. And what happened was, in addition to carrying on these conversations, is for me, all those voices that I kept locked in those lockboxes, that I shushed over the years I just let them out. Because this wasn't really just about Gaza and Hamas and rocket fire. This was something that stretched back much, much farther, back to the origins of Zionism, really. And so all of the doubts that I entertained, I started to entertain very publicly. And I got involved in a few different ad hoc initiatives with other rabbis who were kindred spirits of mine on this issue. Early on, a rabbinic friend of mine, Rabbi Brian Walt, who lives in Martha's Vineyard, has a congregation in Ithaca, New York, and was the founder of Rabbis for Human Rights North America, one of my dearest friends. He and I put a statement together that we wanted to get as many rabbis as possible to sign, that was condemning Operation Cast Lead as an outrage and demanding a cease to hostilities and diplomatic engagement and just solution to the conflict, etc. And we worked very hard to convince friends of ours, colleagues of ours, to sign on. And little by little, after we got them to sign on, but before we published it, we got calls back saying, I'm sorry, but you can't use our names. And they, one by one, they all dropped off. And I wrote about that on my blog later, much later, just about my disappointment more than disappointment, my sorrow that so I know that there are many rabbis out there who feel the way we do about this issue, but just can't speak their minds because of the professional implications of speaking their minds. And it was a very we were in a lot of anguish over what to do with this statement. That how pathetic is that we can't even get a minion of rabbis, 10 rabbis, to sign a statement that was simply calling for simple human rights. At any rate, this sort of opened the door for me to go down a new road. And Brian and I started an initiative called Jewish Fast for Gaza, where we ended up getting well over 1,000 people to sign on to a statement where we were calling for a monthly fast in solidarity with the people of Gaza, calling for an end to the blockade, an end to military operations, an end to the blockade, beginning of real engagement. There was, in the spring, I, with other rabbis, did a one-time initiative that we called Rabbis Remembering the Nakba. I wrote a post where I wrote, I'm not going to celebrate Yom Ha'atzmaut anymore, Israel Independence Day. It was called Why I'm Not Celebrating Yom Ha'atzmaut. And what I wrote in the post was that Israel Independence Day has become, for American civil religion, the Jewish communal holiday in which the community comes together in most major Jewish communities, metropolitan Jewish communities. The major Jewish communal event happens around Israel. It was in Los Angeles, where I was growing up, in all the major cities. In New York City, they had their annual Solidarity with Israel parade. And I said, what does this mean that on a day for Palestinians that they refer to as the Nakba, the day of their collective dispossession, they see Jews around the country and around the world celebrating? And I felt this was not a day I could celebrate as a Jew. This is a day, I didn't say I wouldn't recognize the day or observe the day, but I felt that the day was more accurately or appropriately commemorated through study, through reflection, through soul searching, and reaching out. And so in various cities around the country that year, we had rabbis who invited Palestinians to meet together with Jews to tell just their stories of what occurred to them and their family, in many cases their families, so their parents or grandparents, on that day, which was May 14th, 1948. And I wrote about that on my blog. And this was sort of the nature of my activism going forward. And what I found over time was that I began to understand what the answer to that question of well, what do I do now? Slowly that answer started to emerge. It wasn't clear to me at the time, but I realized that where I belonged as a Jew was standing with Palestinians. And I refused, I'll read you a post in a second where I address this, I refused the zero-sum approach of you stand with us, you stand against us, that as a Jew who believes that his spiritual tradition demands that I stand with the oppressed, that the most important thing I could do as a Jew would be to stand with Palestinians. And I believed, as I put it in that post, that my Jewish liberation was intrinsically bound up with Palestinian liberation. And I found that you can do that, and I found that you can do that and remain in the Jewish community. It did cause a fair amount of dust to be raised in my congregation, as you might imagine, but after the initial dust was raised, we found a way, I think, because of a few things. I think because of the relationships that I had built up over a long period of time, over 10 years with these families, and because of, I think, what we had and have as very visionary leadership. The president of the congregation at the time and the board, when they would get these calls from irate members saying, "What the hell is this rabbi doing? You know, we have family in Israel. We have friends there. We're under attack, and he's standing with the enemy." They didn't respond in a hysterical way to these calls, but rather they said, "Okay, well, we have a situation here. We have a rabbi who's following his conscience, which is what clergy are supposed to do. we accept that there are people in the congregation that may agree with what he's doing. There are many people who clearly don't agree with what he's doing, but how do we find a way to move forward together? And so we put together a process in which we invited outside consultant in conflict resolution that specialized in helping, believe it or not, there's an organization in Philadelphia called the Jewish Dialogue Group that was invaluable in this process, that their mission is to help synagogues talk about Israel-Palestine. And we invited a consultant to come out and train members of our congregation to have small group discussions. We had a large community discussion, and eventually the people who were trained in these discussions became part of a task force that whenever we dealt with this issue, we did so following the dictates of civil discourse, and had ground rules for how we talked about it. And we ensured that we had a balance of programming on this issue so that people felt that their congregation was responding to their relationship to Israel, their understanding of what Israel was, and they didn't feel that because of the very powerful activism that their rabbi was doing, that they were somehow left behind. It's been very difficult. It's been a lot of work, and it never ends. I know that there are always members of my congregation. I have lost some members, but not that many. I've gained members because of my activism, most certainly. I know there are still members who are deeply pained by what I do. I never pretend to speak for my congregation when I speak about this issue in public. It's an ongoing process of really trying to find a way forward, that I can be there for them as their rabbi in a pastoral sense. But at the same time, as a rabbi, I need to follow my prophetic role as speaking my conscience, and what is often called speaking truth to power as I understand it. And I know that's upsetting. And I think places of worship should not be completely complacent. I think one of the things that my criticisms of congregation and why I swore I'd never be a congregational rabbi is because, as I once said to a friend of mine at Rabbinical school, I just don't want to help lots of comfortable middle-class Jews feel more comfortable, And that was a young 24-year-old talking, on the one hand, I don't think that's what our places of worship should be. I think we should look out at the world and be uncomfortable about what is going on. At the same time, congregations can and should be places of comfort and solace, and I think that balance is very important. And I'm finding that I'm able to be a pastor to my congregants as individuals, even as I'm challenging them often in very deep ways on this and other issues in my activism. So what I'd like to do is read a final post, the final post in the book at least, make some final comments, and then I really would love to open it up for conversation, because I'm sure I've skated over any number of issues that folks would like to unpack a little bit more. So this is the last post in the book. It's dated November 29th, 2010, and it's entitled "A Jew in Solidarity with the Palestinian People." As today marks the UN's International Day of Solidarity with the Palestinian People, I'd like to take occasion of this day to publicly state without hesitation that I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people. As a Jew, I will also say without hesitation that I reject the view that I must choose between standing with Jews or standing with Palestinians. This is a zero-sum outlook that only serves to promote division, enmity, and fear. For me, the bottom line is this: the cornerstone value of my religious tradition commands me to stand in solidarity with all who are oppressed. It would thus be a profound betrayal of my own Jewish heritage if I consciously chose not to stand with the Palestinian people. In other words, I believe my Jewish liberation to be intrinsically bound up with Palestinian liberation. It's really that simple. But of course, there is nothing simple or uncomplicated about it. To take such a step is deeply painful in many ways. It means, among other things, facing down my people's own potential for oppression, to admit that the state of Israel, born in the wake of persecution, has itself become a persecutor. However, I must also admit that this pain, uncomfortable though it is nothing compared to the pain being experienced by the Palestinian people on a daily basis. Any person of privilege who stands in solidarity with the oppressed would do well to bear this in mind. While we must explore our own guilt and culpability, we must also bear in mind that it is not ultimately about us. from a wonderful essay on white privilege that is very applicable in this case. And here I'm quoting from a really wonderful essay, as I wrote, by Christopher Bowers, entitled White Privilege, 10 Ways to be an Ally. Solidarity is a long-term participation in the struggle, understanding the part that you play and how the issues affect you personally. As well, solidarity may very well mean not being the center of the solution, but just a small part. It may mean deferring your sense of authority and leadership. It can also mean dropping your own agenda for how change should be achieved. It can be very problematic when the leadership in an organization is people from the dominant culture. When people from the dominant culture define the issues or strategy for oppressed people, it can be condescending and ineffective. So an example of solidarity is being part of community organizing efforts led by people of color, women, etc., in an active but non-leadership role. Being in solidarity means seeing how you will benefit from the liberation of others. And that last line in particular is really, I think, key for my new self-understanding of this work. Being in solidarity means seeing how you will benefit from the liberation of others. And then I continue. And so today I'll take this opportunity to say that I stand in solidarity with the Palestinian people, but I'm not saying so to assuage my Jewish pain and guilt, nor to claim that I personally know how this liberation must eventually be achieved. In the end, I stand here because I know in my heart it is where I must be. And so I'll just end by saying that where I am today is I continue to serve my congregation. I intend to be there for a long time. I just signed a new contract with them for another 10 years or so. A little less now, I'm a few years into it. I am institutionally become very involved with an organization that you heard mentioned as one of the co-founders of our program, Jewish Voice for Peace, which is an organization that is growing by leaps and bounds, and I believe is one of the most important American Jewish organizations today. It's a grassroots membership organization that has local chapters all over the country and includes many non-Jews as well as Jews, but is based in values of human rights and civil rights and democracy for all who live in the land and seek a just peace. Many of those rabbis that I talked about earlier, who were my kindred spirits, we worked together to create a rabbinical council for the Jewish Voice for Peace. And I'm the co-chair, together with Rabbi Alyssa Wise, of the Rabbinical Council that's been around now for about 3 years. I just got back from the national members meeting in the Bay Area last week, and I have to say it is remarkable how this organization has grown, particularly among young people. The youth wing of Jewish Voice for Peace is called Young Jewish Proud, and I am finding increasingly, and one of the most heartening things about the work that I'm doing is the sheer numbers of young Jewish people who identify powerfully as Jews and are motivated by Jewish values, but are kept at bay by the Jewish community on the issue of Israel and Palestine. And Jewish Voice for Peace is an example of an organization that is attracting young people, there are others as well, who are working in solidarity with non-Jews, with young Palestinians all over the country, all over the world really, to build a new kind of movement, a new kind of coalition. And that question that I asked, well, what do I do now? I think where I stand is in coalition with a rapidly growing movement of solidarity that includes very unlikely, heretofore unlikely people, such as myself. And I feel very much at home there, I have to say. In many ways, it grieves me to say that in the institutional world of the Jewish community, I feel far less at home. I speak anywhere that I'm invited, and I speak a great deal to non-Jewish audiences, to Christian audiences, to student groups on campus. I haven't had a great deal of success speaking with Jewish groups, Kadima Reconstructionist Congregation being a notable exception. I also to do a shout out to Kahila Synagogue in Berkeley, where I spoke when I was in the Bay Area, and I'm hugely heartened when Jewish congregations or organizations invite me in to talk to Jewish audiences. But I also know that there are many Jewish people who are just never going to be moved on this issue. And when you're building a movement and building a coalition, I think we have to find a way to have this conversation. We have to widen the boundaries and move forward together, even if we're not 100% there as a Jewish community. But I also, I'm more than ready to step outside the Jewish community and find allies anywhere we can to ultimately to shift power, to make change. I think that's how change happens, right? So that's where I am now, and I'm very heartened. I think my path has not been a strategic one. It's been sort of a work in progress. I'm very hopeful by the reception that my blog has received and my book, and in places where I've been speaking around the country. And so I'll leave it there. I would like to again reiterate that I very much look forward, in addition to sharing my story with you, really to engaging in conversation with you. So there we go. Okay, thank you all.
Thank you.
The issue of BDS, in particular, the issue of Jews feeling unsafe on campus. I think that when different people say that, it means different things to them. I'll be honest with you. I'll confess I have multiple reactions to that. One of my reactions is, as Jews, you feel unsafe? I mean, we are among the most privileged, powerful minorities in the country. I don't think that's, I don't think I'm going on a limb and suggesting that. And what does that mean? What does that really mean to be unsafe? Does that mean you're being challenged? Does that mean that your sense of self is being challenged in a very deep way? I don't know that that's necessarily unsafe. So I think that the word safe, we need to really unpack what that means. And I think that can happen in dialogue. And too often, the conversations around BDS, when divestment resolutions are brought up in student associations, there's a lot of speechifying. There is open mic, and this person says their piece, and that people applaud, and that person says their piece, and that. And I understand, in order to get resolutions passed, that's sort of how it works. That's how it has to work. But in terms of having real dialogue on this issue and helping people understand how the other side feels, that tends to be a casualty. So, I would love, my dream is to be able to find a way to bring students together and really for them to understand what is it. I want to understand what certain Jewish students mean when they say they feel unsafe. There are many, I should mention, there are many Jewish students who speak in favor of BDS resolutions who feel perfectly safe doing so. And I think there's a certain kind of Jewish student, the ones who are standing in solidarity with Israel, who are feeling unsafe. So there's a part of me that, I will be honest with you, that thinks, really? You really feel unsafe? What is threatening you? Is it just that your sense of self is being threatened? On the other hand, I know that the venues in which these comments are made are sort of tailor-made for these kinds of comments, and I would love to find opportunities. I don't see those opportunities happening anytime soon. Hillel has made talking about BDS, Hillel, the Jewish student organization on campus, and International Hillel has a rule that you can't promote BDS or have any kind of speaker about BDS in Hillels around the country, and almost every Hillel abides by this rule, and which basically means that there can never be Jewish dialogue with Palestinians on campuses in Hillels, because just about every Palestinian student group supports BDS. So you see things like what's going on in Harvard, and I'm sure you're familiar with that. There's a group called the Progressive Jewish Alliance at Harvard that was disinvited from Hillel because they wanted to have this kind of a program, and they started an initiative. There's a student-run initiative called Open Hillel, where they're calling for Hillel to change its parameters for how we can have these conversations. And I think that's the way forward. If there are people who feel unsafe, then we need to come together and talk about really what that means. And in the meantime, divestment resolutions are rolling forward, and I applaud that, I have to say. There was just one yesterday in Oberlin that was passed by students, and I think we're going to need to deal seriously with, the casualties, but I don't think we're going to see any end to these resolutions anytime soon. So, there was the question, where would the Jews go after the Holocaust if the Jewish state had not been created? Is that an accurate?
Under the ethnic cleansing program, which ended up with Arabs supposedly being absorbed, but they were never absorbed.
I think it's interesting. Up until 1948, there were many in the Jewish community, including many who identified as Zionists, who were saying that creating an ethnically Jewish state in Palestine was going to end up being a disaster for the Jewish people. Hannah Arendt, for instance, the great Jewish journalist, wrote a piece on the eve of the founding of the State of Israel, saying there's still time, and basically saying this is going to be suicide. This is going to create a Jewish Sparta. She said this is going to create a tiny over-militarized nation in the Middle East that is going to build bigger and bigger weapons and walls between itself and the outside world. You can look at her anthology, The Jewish Writings by Hannah Arendt, and look it up. It was remarkably powerful. And there were others. Rabbi Judah Magnus, who was one of the founders of Hebrew University, who was part of an organization called Brit Shalom that was calling for a binational state, and again, who were saying that going down this road, that there were other solutions to this problem that allowed for Jews and Arabs to coexist inside Palestine, short of creating an ethnically Jewish nation state. And I think what we're seeing now is, it solved one problem, quote unquote, at the time, but now we're reaping what we've sown. And I think many of these concerns were remarkably prophetic. You can't turn back history, but I think we're in many ways seeing that we have to deal now. Where the direction that Zionism has gone since the founding of the state has forced that very issue, which is that the status quo is untenable. And it's going to have to be dealt with in some fashion. And it's going to be either an unthinkable situation in which we have an officially apartheid state where the minority is ruling over the majority militarily, or some kind of arrangement that allows for equal rights and full civil rights and human rights for everybody who lives on the land together. Yes. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Okay. I don't know what Israel has in mind in attacking Syria. I hope there is no war with Iran. I don't. Israel is this is not. I'm not going to say anything that is a major novelty here. Israel is an intensely militarized society, and they've shown willingness to use military solutions in the past. And so, even though my gut is to say I can't believe they would attack Iran militarily. I spent time in Iran in 2008 and went away from there feeling like it would be beyond tragic for this amazing, beautiful country to be attacked for really seeking to have. I don't think any country should have nuclear weapons. I don't think Israel should have nuclear weapons. As a Jew, I feel saddened, sorrowed that Israel, a Jewish state, was the country that introduced nuclear weapons into the Middle East. But when I was in Iran, one of the things that I learned from many the activists that I spoke with there is that, Iran, they reminded me that, countries want nuclear weapons not because they want to use them against other countries, but because they want to feel safe because other countries around them have them as well. And when I was in Iran, I truly understood how it meant to be Iranian on some level, and how vulnerable it feels to be in in a part of the world where there are regimes being militarily overturned by our country, left and right, and that has happened once before in Iran by our country, and now to hear the sabers rattling against them, from their point of view, they want to feel safe, like any nation would. So I could say I've given lots of presentations about my experience in Iran, but all I can say is I hope to God that this is just political bluster. My magic wand, what would I like to see all I want to see is, that's a very simple answer. I want to see some kind of solution. I don't care what it looks like, the political parameters of it, that allows for full citizenship and equal rights and constitutionally guaranteed civil rights for every person that lives in that land, whether they're Jewish or not Jewish. And whatever that looks like, I support. I don't believe that the two-state solution as it's been envisioned by the so-called peace process is going to get us there. I think that is a dead letter. And we can talk about that too if people are interested. So I just want to see I want to see express the kind of values that we all take for granted as Americans. And the question about when I was in rabbinical school, how was this talked about, the issue of Zionism and Zionism as sort of a civil religion of the Jewish people, and how can we start to unlink those? That's a great question. I was a pretty strong Zionist in rabbinical school, and we, you spend a year in Israel as part of the program, as most of the rabbinical program, American rabbinical programs, and living in Israel, studying in Israel, learning about Israel. A Zionist education is part of the reality. However, there are increasing numbers of young rabbinical students in my rabbinical school, RRC, Reconstructionist Rabbinical College, and also Boston Hebrew College that has a rabbinical ordination program, in which there are non-Zionists, young non-Zionists who are accepted to the school and who are trying to find a way to promote a Judaism that is decoupled from Zionism. And it's not easy for them. Many of them are in the JVP Rabbinical Council. We have rabbinical students as well. Alyssa Wise is an example of a woman. She was ordained several years ago, and she was pretty much avowedly anti-Zionist for her entire tenure at RRC, where I went to school. This was after I was there. I remember reading about her and thinking, oh my God, how is that possible? And it was hard for her. And she was, I think, felt on the bubble in terms of just being able to stay there for a long time. But she had champions among the faculty and administration who allowed her to continue. And I think we're seeing growing pains going on in the liberal rabbinical seminaries. You don't see it as much at HUC, at the Reform Seminary, or JTS, the Conservative Seminary, although I'm sure there are probably closeted non-Zionists in those places too, if you pardon my use of that expression, which is probably not completely appropriate. How do we decouple Zionism and Judaism? A lot of my work now and my writing now is around that. I believe that if you look at Judaism, at mainstream Judaism, the rabbis, mainstream is not a good word, traditional Judaism over the centuries, the rabbis were very, very wary of political movements and nationalist movements and militaristic movements. They were constantly, I think, in the wake of the disaster of the destruction of the Second Temple and the rebellions like the Bar Kokhba rebellion and the Hasmonean rebellion, and they understood that those movements were disastrous for the Jewish people. And I don't think that they were pacifist necessarily. I think a lot of it was quietism. In other words, this is going to endanger Jews if we start to rattle our sabers against the host countries in which we live. However, I think there is a strain of what we would call today a nonviolent resistance within mainstream Judaism as well. I think the founding of Yavne after the destruction of the Second Temple, when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai went to the Romans and said, it's yours, just give us this little academy where we can propagate Jewish tradition and keep Jewish tradition alive. That was an early form, in my mind, of cultural resistance, of holding on to a notion of survival that's based in a sense of spiritual and cultural autonomy and resistance. And so Zionism in many ways was a conscious rejection of all of this. It was a group of Jews who, well, that's a pretty ringtone. These were Jewish movements that were consciously rejecting the approach of the rabbis of traditional Judaism and saying that this has brought nothing but persecution to the Jews, and the only way Jews would ever be safe was to have a nation of our own. And mazel tov, So putting your faith in nationalism to keep you safe, I think we're realizing that that was a bit of a Faustian bargain, that maybe even a kind of idolatry, as I believe the rabbis would have it. Putting a national symbol next to the Aron Kodesh, next to the Ark, I think is fairly problematic in all kinds of ways. And so I've been doing a lot of writing that's trying to take the attitude of the rabbis and their response to empire and to militarism and to political movements and sort of update it for the 21st century. Because I think with Zionism, I think we too easily threw out the baby with the bathwater. So.
And the third one was?
That was the third one.
That was the third
three,
one.
yeah.
Okay, and then the 1, 2, 3 knows who they are for the next bunch? Okay.
Okay. The Jewish liberation tied to Palestinian liberation. I think after the Holocaust, Jewish liberation has largely been defined as Jewish survival, Jewish physical survival. And I understand that. I understand psychologically and maybe even spiritually why that would be the case. You read a lot of the post-Holocaust theologians, people like Irving Greenberg and Emil Fackenheim and others, Elie Wiesel. If some of these names mean something to you, there is a strong strain of the most important response to the Holocaust is to affirm Jewish survival at all costs. Am Yisrael Chai, that the people of Israel live. And again, when you've just been to the abyss of possibly being wiped out, I understand how that can be the case. But I also believe that if you hold on to that as your redemptive paradigm exclusively, it leads you down a very dark road. That means your survival at the expense of all else and all others. And I don't believe that we can ultimately find liberation through that paradigm. And when I talk about Jewish liberation, I talk about liberation from a spiritual point of view, which is what I believe that Judaism has always been about. The rabbis, going back to the rabbis and their approach to empire, when the rabbis looked at the story of Hanukkah, they were pretty mortified. The story of the Maccabees was, and the Maccabean victory over the Seleucid Empire, this military victory, was really revived after the birth of the State of Israel. But if you read what the rabbis had to say about Hanukkah, which was a very, very minor holiday, they don't even mention the Hasmoneans. They remember that the Hasmonean dynasty that was founded after Jewish independence was horribly corrupt. They persecuted. It was a priestly dynasty that persecuted the Pharisees, who were the rabbinic forebears. And it only lasted a few hundred years, and the Romans came in and just mopped it all up. And this was a fairly ignoble chapter in Jewish history. And the rabbis, for the holiday of Hanukkah, designated the Haftarah, the prophetic portion from the book of Zechariah that said, "Not by might and not by power." And that is the paradigm of spiritual liberation that I believe is at the center of the rabbinic vision. That liberation is not tied to militarism. It's not tied to even physical survival. That if we focus on spiritual liberation and on transcendent values, that our survival will take care of itself. And I think by switching my own paradigm to standing with the oppressed, which is a time-honored Jewish directive, I believe, that goes back to our most central story, the Exodus story, that I am fulfilling the liberatory vision of my spiritual tradition. And I think all great traditions, the Exodus story, all great Western traditions certainly, and many more I'm sure. The Exodus story has inspired countless movements of liberation, Jewish and non-Jewish. And so that's what I mean when I say my Jewish liberation is bound up with Palestinian liberation, that it's a very difficult step to take, I think, because the liberatory paradigm has been so radically shifted for so many of us. I can't read my own writing here. Oh, yes, following Western tradition. Yes, right. Right, yeah, real. Yeah, Western political tradition is not as rosy as, I know. You know, I think you hear two things coming out of Israel. You hear that we are the only democracy in the Middle East. And you also hear, well, we're in a tough neighborhood, and this is the way nations behave here in this part of the world. You Westerners don't understand that you have to be, you have to be strong in order to survive in this part of the world. So I think we hear a kind of two different, very, very radically different messages. And I often hear I think increasingly the latter one is the one that's predominating. That I don't think that there is a cherishing of Western style values, the kinds that you're articulating at least. Increasingly, if you look at the attitudes through surveys of Israelis and the values that are held by folks, largely the progressive numbers are shrinking. Many of them are leaving the country. It's becoming the values that are being espoused there are counter to the kinds that you're describing, is all I can say. And too often I think we have expectations that, I understand that we in the West it's a form of colonialism, I suppose, that we try to remake other countries in our own image through Western values and democratic values, and I understand that. My feeling is, as a Jew and as an American, this is a state that's acting in my name, that claims me for its own legitimacy, and as an American and as a citizen of the country that is its most important political, diplomatic, and military patron, that I have a very real stake in advocating for what should happen, how we might go forward. And finally, I haven't had much dialogue with AIPAC, although we had a speaker from AIPAC speak in my congregation. It didn't go very well. I don't necessarily see a change in influence at all, really. I think that, the political system is set up in such a way that a group like AIPAC has enormous influence. I don't put a lot of stock in using the political system to leveraging the political system to make change. I used to be very active in J Street. I used to be very active in organizations like Brit Tzedek V'Shalom. I used to visit and lobby. I used to go on these lobbying junkets where I'd visit senators in their offices and urge them that we shouldn't let this opportunity pass by. And I'm realizing now that the political system is fairly well stacked for some very compelling reasons, and that's why I support movements like BDS, which I think are outside the political system. Those are popular movements that are trying to leverage pressure in different ways that I think have historically proved successful, that basically creates a situation in which political elites have to eventually respond because the popular advocacy is moving them in that direction. There are so many examples of this. We often put so much faith in the political process to leverage change. And politicians are not change agents. Obama, I'm speaking for myself. He talked about change we can believe. He was a community organizer who then became the world's biggest insider, basically, and ran as a change agent And I think he really understands. When he said in Jerusalem, when he was speaking to these young Israeli people, and he says, politicians won't make any change unless you demand we make change. That was his community organizer self-talking. But for us to put faith in politicians to do the right thing, it historically does not happen. As Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand. It never has and it never will. And there's so many examples of it. President Johnson, who Judith and I were talking about him today, one of the great presidents, he didn't sign the Voting Rights Act because he was a lover of civil rights. There was a huge movement, popular movement, that was forcing his hand, so he had to got to that point that he was able to take that step. And it was a movement, by the way, that involved boycott, right? Some time-honored nonviolent resistance techniques. So I think, for me, I'm much more comfortable standing outside senators' offices now and protesting as opposed to going in and trying to urge them to do the right thing. But I think there's also room for all. I don't judge those. I have lots of colleagues in J Street and friends who I respect, and it's an ongoing discussion about where we see our energies going. But for me, I believe that BDS has the most potential to create the kinds of real pressure for real change that we need to see happen. And that's why I don't spend a lot of time worrying about AIPAC, quite frankly.
Wow, okay, those are 3 good ones.
Yeah, that's a great question. No, these are all great. Wow, great questions. I don't know when change will come. I have many Palestinian American friends who actually are quite optimistic that around my age, maybe a little younger, that in their lifetime they're going to see some change. And I feel like I have enough of those friends that I feel as if I have no right to be pessimistic myself. But I also know that historically, often you reach tipping points and things change very quickly. I remember very vividly in the 1980s, the fall of apartheid. I remember vividly, like less than a year before it fell, having a conversation with my father about what on earth do you think is going to happen in South Africa, and him saying, I really don't see anything other than a bloodbath. I don't see how anything else could be. And in very short order, we saw the fall of apartheid. South Africa has, it's a process. Liberation is a process. That doesn't mean it's happily ever after, but I think there are tipping points, and they often come when we least expect them. I think we engage in the struggle, and that's, for me, putting one foot in front of the other is the most important thing. Eastern philosophy. It's funny you should say that. I have many members of my congregation who are identify Jewishly, but get a great deal of of their own spiritual nourishment from Eastern philosophies, largely Buddhism and also to a certain extent Hinduism. I see myself increasingly studying Eastern traditions, probably more than even my own tradition. That's because I've been so immersed in Jewish tradition for so long that I really feel like I owe it to myself, and that my experiences and actually right now I'm particularly involved in Hindu study with a Hindu teacher actually, and I find that I'm able to make connections through my own experience and my own Jewish understanding with these systems that are quite powerful. And I do agree with you that one of the things I'm trying to unlearn is sort of Western religious dualism. Person, God. I'm here, God's there, and theological dualism. And I've learned a great deal from, and there are examples in Jewish mystical tradition that are non-dualistic. They tend to be very rarefied. They're very esoteric, but I've learned a great deal from them. But there's something quite immediate and accessible about Eastern traditions that I learn a great deal from, and I've tried to incorporate into my own understanding. I don't pretend to be a practitioner of Eastern traditions. Actually, I have many congregants who are probably much better versed in some of these traditions than myself, and I've learned a lot from them. I think you're seeing right now in the Jewish world a coming together of West and East in all kinds of very interesting ways, and you may have heard of some of these trends. Buddhism in particular. There's much, much more I could say about it, but my short answer to you is yes. Allegiance. Judaism, Jewish American, it's not, when you said putting your religion before your nationality, being Jewish is a strange thing. It's a hard thing to define. It's not simply religion. I don't think it's a nationality. I think there is an Israeli nationality, but I, as someone who is not too enamored of nationalism in general, I don't think that Zionism has succeeded in turning Judaism into a national identity, a political national identity. Jews have always, from time immemorial, described themselves as a people. The Hebrew term is Am Yisrael, the people of Israel. There's a certain sense of belongingness of being Jewish, and it's a hard thing to pin down. But Jews feel, I think most American Jews who identify as Jews, there are many assimilated American Jews, but I'm talking about the ones who would call themselves Jewish Americans. I'm going to go out on a limb and say I think most of them understand that as American citizens, that this country has been a blessing to them, that they, whatever ambivalence they have about what America does as a nation, I think that Jews have thrived in the United States, and I think most Jewish Americans feel that way and feel allegiance to this country for that reason. I don't think most surveys say that increasing numbers of Jews feel less and less connected to the state of Israel. I don't think, if we're talking about strictly national allegiance, I think different Jews have different levels of a sense of what that means, but I think most Jews are very comfortable being Americans, is my sense. So the question of Netanyahu and revisionist Zionism, I think Netanyahu is through and through a revisionist Zionist. And I think what he's doing today is very much in keeping with that ideology. Jabotinsky, who was the father, Vladimir Zev Jabotinsky was the father of revisionist Zionism, talked about an iron wall, between Jews and Arabs. And what we're seeing now is, in many ways, sort of a 21st century version of that. And not only the building of the wall, the actual wall, but no, I don't think he has any interest in a two-state solution. I think it's very clear to me what he's interested in, because he's doing it. He's doing it in the light of day. He is, I'll use the term, ethnically cleansing Area C of Palestinians through home demolitions and revoking residency rights and forcible eviction and military harassment, moving Palestinians out of that area, moving Palestinians, consolidating them in areas A and B, in these isolated areas that are basically sort of Israeli versions of what we saw in South Africa as Bantustans, keeping them separate and warehousing them, in the words of Jeff Halper, Israeli peace activist Jeff Halper, warehousing humanity in areas A and B. And he's pretty much completed it. I mean, it's pretty much done. It's all but annexed, and now he has partners in his coalition Naftali Bennett and his party, Bayit Yehudit, that it's part of their policy to annex Area C. So, no, I don't think he's interested in a two-state solution. I think what he's interested in, he's doing. And that's why, to me, the peace process is so empty, because the various players who are trying to shepherd this peace process are not doing anything to stop, have not done anything to stop this process, and now it's pretty much done. Those are the facts on the ground. So that's that. Pinkwashing. I'm, apart from the possibly prejudicial use of that term, I am sympathetic to those who say that there is a cynical use of LGBTQ rights in Israel being used as a propaganda tool by Israel to show what a wonderful democracy it is. And in a way, it's not just on that issue. It's on any number of issues. There's a focus on, look at these enlightened Western-style rights that we are affording Jewish citizens, right? But to me, that is a way of distracting attention away from what is being done to non-Jewish residents, non-Jewish citizens of Israel and non-Jewish residents in West Bank and Gaza. That's really the issue. And I wrote a piece on my blog that actually angered a lot of people who I usually make happy about the women at the wall. And many of you may be following this, that there's which to me is, in some ways, it's not exactly the same because I don't think it's being used for propagandistic purposes, but there's a movement of women who are seeking equal rights at the Western Wall to pray, which they do not have. They're not allowed to pray openly at the wall. And women have been arrested and roughed up, and it's been horrible. And there is a movement in Israel now. There's sort of a Jewish solidarity with the women at the wall all over the world. And I wrote, I wrote this in a blog post right after a human rights report of children in detention, Palestinian children in Israeli detention, military detention, which was just truly horrifying. And I basically wrote in the post, why is all of this attention for Jewish rights in a Jewish state? That is what mobilizes us. That is what is, in all these major Jewish communities around the country, Jews are standing in solidarity with the women at the wall. And there's not a peep out of our community about Jewish soldiers snatching children out of their beds in the middle of the night and interrogating them, and not giving them any lawyers, and their parents not knowing where they are, why aren't we standing in? I said there's something wrong with the priorities in my community, and and there were many people who wrote back very angrily, including many activists and women at the wall, who said we also stand with Palestinians. But my point was that the more that we focus on Jewish rights in a Jewish state at the expense of what we're doing to non-Jews in that state, the more we're detracting attention away from what I think is the essential problem, the essential issue. We are all one, and the focus on the essential humanity of one another, of course. I think, though, that in addition, I don't think that simply an emphasis on the essential humanity of all peoples is going to get us where we want to go, right? And then within, that there is a larger issue of power inequity and power being used by the more powerful on the less powerful that needs to be addressed. And too often, many of these coexistence programs, which are quite wonderful and are quite successful on the interpersonal level, they occur within a framework of such inequity, an unequal power dynamic that until we face that, which is in some ways a lot more painful and difficult. I think it's painful for Jews to, as I said in that last blog post, that means facing the fact that we've become our own worst nightmare in a sense, and I think there's a great deal of self-reflection that needs to happen in our community about what's brought us to this point, and asking the question of how are we going to fundamentally change this system that is so fundamentally imbalanced. I have many friends who do a lot of coexistence work inside Israel, and I admire what they do. And I used to be my congregation is still very involved in many of them. There's an organization in Chicago called Hands of Peace that does coexistence work. It brings Palestinian and Israeli children, high school age kids, together with American kids, and they do coexistence work and conflict resolution and dialogue, and they always come to JRC for Shabbat. And I used to be on their board. And I support this work. I don't judge it, but I also try to help people understand that when these kids go back to Israel and one of them is holding a gun at a checkpoint and the other is being strip searched, that all of the really important good work of the shared humanity that happened in that room in Chicago, and some of the Israelis say, well, I'll think twice the next time, and I'll be kinder at the checkpoint. And I genuinely believe that they mean this. It's heartbreaking, okay. But I think we can't let ourselves lose sight of the focus on the system itself. And finally, BDS, young Jews standing standing in solidarity with Palestinians. I see it happening increasingly. I think they get it in ways that my generation and older just don't. I've learned a great deal from young people. I took a group of 20 congregants to the territories. We stayed in refugee camps. We went to the nonviolent demonstration that was held on Friday in one of the Arab villages. And the young people in the trip, the 20-somethings in the trip, were the ones who just understood. They got it immediately. They didn't feel a whole lot of ambivalence. They weren't as much anguish as some of the older folk. So I think we're seeing increasingly many Jewish, I think on college campuses we're going to see more, this goes back to your question, of the Jews who say they feel unsafe. I predict we're going to see more young Jews finding the wherewithal to stand in solidarity with Palestinians, especially in nonviolent resistance like BDS, than we do those who are trying to see their job on college campuses as defending Israel. That's my prediction because it's anecdotal, but I see it happening. I visit college campuses all over the country, and every SJP I visit, Students for Justice in Palestine, there's a core of Jewish students there. And so I think that's one of the things that gives me hope for the future. Yes, I'll repeat it. So the question was, she understood the political crisis that I went through, the institutional crisis I went through when I broke with Zionism, but what about the spiritual crisis? Was there a spiritual crisis that in some way involved decoupling Zionism from Judaism? Absolutely. I mean, that's to me what this is about. And that was the core of my crisis because Zionism was my Judaism. And I realized how religiously I bought into it in ways that I never really even stopped to consider. And one of the things I'm working on now that it may be another book someday, I don't know, but is creating a theology, a Jewish spiritual vision that in many ways was my answer to your question, which is rooted in what I understand the values of traditional Judaism, diaspora-centered Judaism, this brave tradition that after the destruction of the temple and the dispersal of Jews all over the world made some very remarkable decisions in reconstructing a tradition that would allow it to thrive wherever Jews were. And these mighty empires came and went, and Jews are still there, and what does it mean that Zionism just threw all of that out and rejected that? And what would it mean to reaffirm that in a 21st century context in an era largely of Jewish power and privilege? And so those are the things I think a great deal about. And I find personally very meaningful and very fruitful. I think there's a lot to work with on those issues. And so most of my writing lately, my private writing has been on trying to come up with a Jewish theology of liberation, and that might speak to to other Jews who struggle in similar ways.
Okay, on that note, again, thank you.